And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Joining me on the line tonight is my good friend, Neil Bodenheimer. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing good.
All right. Well, whenever Mr. Glenn Beck is making some news here, I always like to bring on the hammer here, Neil, with me and talk about Beck. And, now, admittedly, this encompasses more than Glenn Beck, but I think it highlights exactly the difficulties, the problems, the confusion that the political right is having right now in America. And Neil, Mr. Beck just did a special report on his own channel about the collapse of America, the impending collapse of America. And it's really no different than what he talks about on a daily basis, other than he's got a new intro special report, a little bit more bells and whistles before the podcast starts, right? And he comes out running and gunning, talking about how America looks lost. Here we go. Immigration. Joe Biden's not stopping any of it. And defund the police and inflation. America's about to collapse. America's about to collapse. And Neil, listen, I'm talking to more and more conservatives. He's not saying something a lot of conservatives at this point in history are not feeling. Everybody knows something is wrong with the country right now, right? The country is going perpetually to the left. The country is becoming more and more morally depraved, economically corrupt, politically corrupt. I sense lots of dispiritedness from the right, but also from myself, where I see a world, and even somebody who's more in the integralist mindset. And while I love to critique both the left and the right, I don't want America going down this path because I got to live here. I got to raise children in this society as well too, and we're all sensing it. I guess the problem that I have with our friends on the political right at this point is that they're kind of going back to the well. They're kind of out of ideas at this point, Neil. We got to get there and we got to vote. We got to vote. We got to vote. You hear Glenn Beck sounding the alarm, right? It's panic time. It's panic time. But Neil, as long as I've been in the conservative movement, we've been ringing the alarm about panic time, about the impending collapse of America. I mean, Glenn Beck has been selling gold on his channel, talking about this impending collapse for 30 years, and nothing ever changes. Neil, will these guys ever figure out what the core root of the problems is in America?
No, because the core root of the problem has to do with America itself and its system. It's built into the very system that we have, and it's this idea of, well, as long as we're free, to the extreme, license really, um, then it's a okay. As long as it's the will of the people, then it's a okay. Um, there is no moral boundary that cannot be crossed as long as we are quote unquote consenting adults, and as long as we're as a majority voting for these things, then it's all acceptable. Um, well, I mean, how has the Constitution not been violated, right? And then on top of that, how many moral depravities do we have that are completely in line with the Constitution that don't violate it? So really, I think at the core of the if you want to say that the core of this problem is this idea that we have a country where its founding has to do with do what you want as long as we're all consenting and as long as it's a majority rule, right? As long as we've all voted for this thing to happen, then it's all okay, right? That's
Yeah.
the problem. So of course you're going to have this society because when the people are given the power to give themselves whatever they want, then there's nothing that's going to restrain them from taking whatever they want, even the most depraved, disordered acts.
Yeah, I think, for Mr. Beck, who constantly cites the idea of how the Bill of Rights is being violated, or it's collapsed, or the government has violated the Bill of Rights and things of that nature. He screamed about the importance of the Bill of Rights. He even said so much. Listen, when he looks at the far left of America, says if we can't even agree on that, then there's no meeting in the middle with the far left. And I get that, but I think there's a basic problem the political right has, and it's very fundamental. And I'll explain this as simple as I can. They have the idea since the founding that government is bad, but the consent of the people is good. That's a problem.
Hmm.
Okay. Because again, government can be fallen, but the government consists of the people voting in what they want, essentially, to give consent ultimately to the government. The idea that, again, in a nation where we have religious indifferentism, we have no greater overarching moral principles or cultural values or tradition of sorts that forms an identity, but even more so, a moral compass, and that somehow the will of the people going to the polls hand in hand, that we're always going to make the right choice. As Ronald Reagan said, I think we've proven that notion false. And we have to start asking ourselves some fundamental questions. How is this supposed to work out in the end when we have such a great part of our uh, our population now that's completely disordered, and I would argue to some extent demonically possessed, and yet they got the power to go to the polls and to justify all these immoralities, all their fallen nature, their fallen passions. And that's what we're seeing at this point. And how do you account for the fact that a lot of these same citizens have been bought and paid for in a certain respect? I think there's a fundamental problem we have right now with democracy, and the political right is simply going back to the same talking points that if we get back to the Constitution, everything is going to be okay. But we've been deviating from the Constitution for over 250 years. I don't see how and why we would go back, and even more so, even if we could jump in Doc Brown's time machine and go
Yeah.
back to 1776 or 1789, pick your date, how it wouldn't end up again this way. We're here for a reason, and I think we have some serious foundational issues, Neil.
Yeah. I mean, look, the right thinks in terms of economics more than anything. So when they go, well, the Constitution, they're not talking about morality. They're not talking about social things. They're saying the Constitution being violated in some way that hurts the economy, right? That hurts the foreign policy, maybe, or how the representatives of the government are acting. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says, you know, LGBT plus people, can't do what they want to do,
Right.
or this trans thing. There's nothing wrong with that in the Constitution. Nothing is stopping that in the Constitution. So when they talk Constitution, they're only talking about procedural things or the economy, right? How the government's being run, and then how the economy is being affected, that kind of thing. So they want to go back to the Constitution to fix that, but it's like, but your soul is the problem. Your soul has rotten away. There's no moral standard anymore, right? And without that, then who cares how effectively the government's being run? And as I said before, the Constitution is they don't enforce it, so it's no law to me. It means nothing. It's just paper because no one enforces the Constitution really. It's just a matter of, well, we interpret it differently now, so therefore it doesn't apply. So I don't see what going to the Constitution is going to do when you don't enforce what's there, and the things you don't like, you just reinterpret it according to the Supreme Court, our high priest on the court.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental contradiction on the right, something that they've never rectified historically with our constitutional principles, because there is this emphasis on individual rights. And yet, when we have issues that involve greater community standards, there's always this confliction between individual rights and what's best for the common good of society. Whenever those two ideas conflict, individual rights always wins at sort of, at the
Yeah.
expense of the greater good. And I think this is the problem that they have, especially when it comes to a lot of the disordered issues that we're dealing with now, where everybody's claiming freedom and liberty and love and things of that nature, how they feel, what they want, that American, we're free. You can't tell me what to do because of my individual rights. Kiss my ass. And the moment that, let's say, those on the social right say, wait a minute, we got to have greater community standards. We got to have at least some general overarching moral principles. It is actually the right that is the first to scream, you can't do that because that's socialism. You're inviting government into basically our system, and government is the ultimate evil. We want nothing to do with government. But you did away with the church. And so when you do away with the church, and I listen, I don't want to get into the argument about the state churches at the founding. We are where we are now,
Mhm.
okay? And again, the principles that be based on the constitutional principles allow for the eradication of the state churches. But when it comes down to it, when human will is broken, the human spirit is broken, and the disorders begin to take their toll out on every individual, who is there to call fair and foul in our society? Who? It has to be the government. There's no choice. You divested the church of its power to be a true check on government. You because of your malformed theology at the very beginning of the founding of the nation, in many ways, right? A Protestant Masonic nation. But here we are now, and somebody's saying, wait, what are the rules? What are the moral principles? And everybody on the left is simply using the principles of the founding, saying individual rights, freedom, liberty, kiss my ass. You can't tell me what to do. If I want to indulge in sin, I'm an American. It's my
Yeah.
right, Neil.
Well, yeah, I'm kind of curious as to why do they think it's wrong to not have individual rights? Like, where are they getting that from? That moral stand? Because that's a moral claim. That
Well,
it
that's
that
a Lockean idea, I believe, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, that was my point to them is that they want to deny that it's Lockean. They want to
Yeah.
deny. They want to say it's Christian. All right, but then if it one that's not that the whole this whole individual rights sir trumps everything else is not Jesus. That's not Christian. All right, because Jesus very clearly lays out a hierarchy of authority, but they want to claim it's Christian. To which I say, yeah, but you say separation of church and state. This We're not supposed to have that. Oh, okay, well then it's wrong because it violates the Constitution. Hold on, you're saying it's wrong. To say it's wrong is a moral claim, but you're telling me individual um, desire, individual rights surpasses all of that, trumps all of that, right? Where are you getting this idea of morality? Well, because of our Judeo-Christian, whatever that means, Judeo-Christian values. Okay. Well, once again, though, you're appealing to a Christian or religious system of morality, but the government clearly says we can't have religion in our state, in our founding, in our government. So why do you keep appealing to, well, it's a Christian nation, it's a Christian, Judeo-Christian values, when those values cannot, by this government's definition, apply to it because it says no, that has no place here. We have secular rulership, secular values. And if that is indeed the case, as our government has said, and as the Supreme Court has said, then you can't complain, Glenn Beck, about the state of the country at that point, other than it being your personal feelings.
Yeah.
Like you can't say, well, the government is wrong because to say it's wrong means you're once again appealing to a moral system that the government itself denies. The only quote unquote morality is the laws that they put in place, which are always up to be changed at on a moment's notice. And once it changes, you have to do, really, they have been consistent in this part. They have to do as Republicans have been doing. Simply, well, we were conserving this, but now that this has happened, we're now going to move forward and we're going to conserve the new thing. Because as like before the whole plus plus thing was going on, right? So the those on the right would say, "What? We're not going to allow this kind of plus plus stuff going on. We're not going to. We're conservatives. We're conservative traditional marriage, right? Well, then it became normalized, and now they say, well, listen, what two people consenting adults do, all right, is none of my business, right? Just, I mean, they're normal. They're regular people too, And we're gonna like Glenn and the rest of them celebrated that. Was it Dave Rubin having basically what I would call child abuse, taking a child, having a child now with two dads or that kind of thing. They all happy about that. Congratulations, that kind of thing, right? So they've moved. Now they're saying, well, we'll allow that. We'll be okay for that as long as you're consenting adults and as long as you're on the right with us. Okay. Now, if you were a leftist, we might be more against you, but we're still going to allow you to do those things. So it's like they keep moving. They keep moving. Why? Because at their hearts, they're Americanists. They're not really rock solid in the teachings of Jesus Christ and Christianity. What they're built into is Americanism. And when the laws change, their principles alter along with it. And they move progressively to, well, the left. And so it's just going to keep getting worse.
Yeah, it's interesting because you bring up the idea of Judeo-Christian values, which is a term that is very often used on the political right. I remember the likes of Limbaugh and Dennis Prager and guys like Hanny. Those guys would use that term and that phrase. And it's interesting to me because recently something has come up, and Jewish conservative commentator Dennis Prager has been making his rounds in Catholic circles. Right, he went to, I believe, Steubenville University, and they had a bunch of debates online with Catholics about pornography. And of course, Mr. Prager prides himself off being a religious Jew and a theologian. And he's been going around making the case that he doesn't believe that you could sin with your mind. He doesn't have a problem with pornography because you have to take action in order to be able to sin. I mean, he even went in, so far as to say that that anybody that believes that you can sin with your mind is the equivalent of a far leftist who condemn everybody for thoughts, right? For the thoughts
What,
you may have in your
what,
mind in the
let me
political.
jump in real quick with
Yes.
that. You can't sin with your thoughts. So is he saying that you can hold the belief that God is evil and that's not a blasphemous thought to have?
He would
Because
say you have to
you're
show action on how you hate God.
but you can't act on a belief system like God is evil. You can't act that out other than having bad morals, but that would be subjective at that point. So it doesn't matter what you believe anymore.
Right. So essentially, pornography is not bad in his mind. It's like, okay, it's not a good thing, right? And this is again, it goes back to this whole individual rights thing and what is for the greater good of the community, right? And this is the struggle that the political right has. Whenever you have this confliction between individual rights and ultimately the greater standard for the community, individual rights always has to win. And this is why they can't hold the line of morality. But even more so, as Christians and as Catholics, we've held for 2,000 years that you could sin with the mind. Lust is a mortal sin. Our Lord said,
Hmm.
any man that looks at a woman has committed adultery. Now, whether the non-Catholics or the non-Christians like that or not, what it shows is we have different values at the end of the day, right? Because if you're, I what Prager has actually done by saying you can't sin with the mind, he has shot dead the notion that we have these Judeo-Christian values in America. No, because lust and sinning with the mind is big in Christianity. And it shows you, at least in Mr. Prager's case, we don't have the same values right
Yeah.
now, Neil.
Yeah, and it makes me think also when you say that, I'm just listening how stupid this is. Even the Jews believe in a rebellion of the angels, as far as I know. Um, in that, thus you have demons and angels because of their rebellion from God. But and the angelic creatures don't have a physical body, so their sin had to be that of the intellect. It's a rebellion against God,
That's interesting.
but they didn't do it in a physical way, so they didn't act it out in that sense.
Right.
So it was that of their will, their intellect that was the sin. So how would he explain that then? Because
Well, what he's dealt with biblically, at least, is the idea of coveting thy wife and coveting goods. He says the translation on that is not one of that equates lust of sorts, right? That you have to act on, really. That no, I forgot how he explained it away, but he explained it away and dismissed it. He says there's nothing in the Old Testament effectively that condemns lust. Therefore, you can't sin by, say, looking at another woman or even lusting after your wife or things of that nature.
yeah, but doesn't God say rend your hearts, not your garments? So the implication being that's internal, not external.
Right.
And on top of that, the
Right.
covet is to desire something. Otherwise, the commandments are being repetitious.
Right. And
Thou
I
shalt
think
not steal, and then thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Why would he say
right.
it twice?
Well, see, they got another problem too, right? Just like that position shoots down the idea that Christians and let's call it Jews here because he's Jewish
Yeah.
we have these common Judeo-Christian
Yeah.
values. We don't have that anymore. There's another problem, right?
Yeah.
because when conservatives remove the idea of culture and religion from sort of the political discourse where those don't matter, their argument has always been we have to win in the battle arena of ideas. And they've always said we have to change hearts and minds apart from the theological principles of our ancestors because we've done away with that in the name of religious indifferentism, right? In the name of religious liberty in America. But here's the problem. How can you tell me that we need to change hearts and minds to get them to vote the right way when pornography is one of the main things in our society that actually poisons both the heart and the mind, Neil? I don't understand it.
Yeah, I mean the roots of sin begin in the mind.
Exactly.
So I don't understand how you can have this dividing line of, well, it doesn't count when it's up here. It only counts when it's here in the hands. Okay, yeah, but this caused that. it, it feels like there's a denial of the fact that we are incarnate spirits. It's denying the spirit,
Yeah.
and it's making us merely material creatures. Um,
How far do you think that separates us from Jews like Dennis Prager?
well, that right there, I mean that is evidence from my belief that we're separate, not just separate religions. All right, but I don't. I'm believing less and less that we actually follow the same God.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm
Be-
thinking too, actually.
because I mean, I know that I've been listening to some of the traditionalists who talk about that, and it makes sense that I believe it even says in scripture that and I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like, what do we have to do with those who deny Jesus Christ? Basically, those who deny Jesus Christ, they're not following the same God, right? We believe in a triune God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. If they're going to deny Son and Holy Spirit, or just the Son, even, then that's
Mhm.
a completely different God because there's no separation between the three. They are one. So, and when he says stuff like this, I'm more and more like, well, how can you say Judeo-Christian? Well, you have to tell me, what are your values? What are the Jewish values that I'm sharing in order to say Judeo-Christian value?
Well, he would say, "Don't murder, don't steal, private property rights," which is perfectly American, right?
Yeah, but his argument would, we'd have a problem with the thou shalt not murder part, because from my understanding is that the Jews can allow for abortion because of how they interpret when life begins.
Okay, see, that's
Not
interesting.
every not every Jew, but there's like, it's mixed.
Yeah, and there's almost a Protestant feel to the
Yeah.
issue of abortion in Judaism to me, right? Because some Jews are for, some Jews are against it. Now, I know controversial figure E. Michael Jones argued that when Roe v. Wade was overturned in America, something like, I don't know, 90, 100 Jewish organizations came out condemning the Supreme Court decision in the name of religious freedom because it was part of their Jewish religious, uh, you know, moral
Yeah.
codes that they can abort their children.
Hmm.
So now, you got all these sectarian divisions in Judaism like you do in Protestantism, right? You got
Yeah.
no, moral authority at the end of the day or final arbiter of truth. Even on this pornography issue, I actually did find a Jew online. I forgot what his name was, but who did argue Dennis Prager was wrong. Of course, as Jews, we believe you can sin with the mind. So it comes down now, again, like the issue of Protestantism, to biblical interpretations. And this is where I think there's an issue too, because I listened to Prager for years. And one of the things that he sells himself on, where he gives himself sort of this authority to speak, he considers himself a theologian, right? And when we're
Yeah.
talking about the Old Covenant, Old Testament, that's viewed in light of history as a book of the Jews, why do we trust the interpretations of Christians rather than Jewish theologians, Neil?
Well, my question is, why do we trust Jews who denied Christ and their interpretation of Scripture?
Yeah.
By the way, the Protestant version of Scripture is based on what the Jews came up with about 100 years or so after Christ.
Yeah, they
They
removed
rem-
the
they
Deuterocanon.
removed stuff
Yeah,
because it pointed to Christ, the
yeah.
Messiah.
Yeah.
So why are we trusting their interpretation of it?
Right. And that's what it comes down to is Prager's interpretation of scripture in the case of pornography and lust, which he says does not exist. A condemnation that nowhere exists in the Old Testament. And that's what we're debating. So if you don't believe in the new covenant, of course, established by Christ, that leaves Jews in a precarious position to say, okay, lust is not condemned, therefore pornography is okay.
Yeah, and why would the action be bad then? If at your heart lust, there's nothing wrong with lust.
Yeah.
Because lust is in the mind, right?
Right.
If there's nothing wrong with that, it's not sinful, then why would the act then be evil too? What makes the act evil then?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he would argue in extreme circumstances, for example, right? Let's say you have a wife that's very sick and she can't partake of the marital act anymore, that he believes it's morally acceptable for a man to watch porn and practice, again, the sin of self pleasure in order to get a release in such an extreme circumstance.
Yeah.
Neil.
So you're saying fornication, adultery is okay because, hey, she couldn't put out for me. So I got to get it somewhere because I'm an animal
Right.
and I can't control myself.
Yeah. You know what's the interesting thing about that? That's situational ethics. That's exactly what the
Yeah.
left uses to break down all moral principles, Neil.
Yeah. It's called subjectivity. It's subjectivism, relativism.
Yeah.
So using that kind of logic, you can justify anything.
Right.
Where I can follow that same process to get to anything. Well, in certain circumstances, it's ridiculous. And plus, once again, in order to say my act is evil, it also had to have it has to be evil up here too, because that act came from a desire, an act of the will. Okay, it came from the will, which has to do with the mind. So if it's not wrong to entertain, and we're not talking about a passing thought, right? We're not talking about a passing attraction. We're talking about something you're entertaining. You're mulling it over. Okay.
Yep.
You have now used your will to keep mulling that thing over, to keep it in your mind, your imagination. All right. Which then led to an action, which means all of that had to be wrong for that act to be wrong. Because if all of this was pure, that process, nothing wrong up there, then how does it follow that the action was wrong? Because I just did what I wanted to do. And if what I want is good, then what I did must be good. If what I want is neutral, then what I did must be neutral. Like, what happens that the desire turns into an evil only because I've done it? And if what I'm doing is evil, then the desire, the will that wanted to do it, must also be evil.
Right.
Like, how do you disconnect it like that? That, once again, that's like saying I have no spirit. I have no spirit. I'm just a material animal. And his argument there about, well, she's ill and I've got to get it off, right?
Yeah.
That's an animal. I'm just a material creature. I can't help myself. I have no self-mastery. I've got to do this. And I think it's funny that in that analogy, he's saying he's using a man as an example, like the man has to,
Sure.
right? Automatically, we've got this idea that, well, men can't control themselves. That's like assumed that men just have to get their rocks off. And it's like, it hasn't been that way really until the modern era. Because previous to this, men were taught you need to have self-control. That was number one.
Right, but here's a counter argument from classical liberals, and I've heard this, right? Men that lived in monasteries in centuries past, right? Holy religious men that claimed to live a life of chastity, the way they actually dealt with it in those days is that they were having sex with each other.
So because you think it's unbelievable, you have to add this idea that they were just all gay.
Well, no. It's funny. They won't say they were gay. They just say they practiced the act of sodomy as a way for that release because that's who was there. There was no women around. They were isolated.
That's called gay.
I'm just telling you what.
That's what it is.
Told me. I'm being honest here, and I've gotten this.
They were not forced to be there. These vows are voluntary. And once again, they're making that up in order to because in their own minds, listen to how depraved of a society and people we are.
Yeah.
They're so depraved, they can't even fathom men sacrificing that desire and urge, sacrificial love. They can't even imagine it.
Yeah.
So of course they had to be gay. Of course they had to be doing this and that, because you can't even think of a world where that happened. That's more says more about them than it does the monks of 1,000 years ago.
And it really just diminishes the great sacrifices that many men of the religious life have made, and also men within marriage that have done their best to maintain sort of this this sexual drive that drives us crazy, especially in this day and age, in a hypersexualized era of human history where we're all being tempted like never before. And
Yeah.
so I've never liked that argument either, because we know there have been very holy priests in the past. There's been priests and the clergy that have fallen without a doubt. But a blanket statement like that really diminishes what the religious life is, when so many of those great religious leaders, what we have today is thanks to them. They're great sacrifices
Yeah.
in many ways. And so, and really to end it with Prager here, what he basically says at the end of all this is that, listen, guys, this porn issue, I get it. It's bad. But do we really need to get caught up on this? Don't we got bigger problems like communism and fascism? Because that's what I'm committed to stopping, is these great evils throughout human history, Neil.
Well, my question is, and I don't deny that those are evils, or great evils. My question is, why is that one considered the greatest thing?
Because that's the big one. They murdered, which violates the classical liberal sort of divine law of private property rights.
The communists and socialists who murdered, okay, no one ever said that what they were doing was morally good or acceptable or even legal. All right. They kind of controlled their countries as a dictator and forced it upon them. Right. What we do in America is way worse, because we all voted for it. We're all in support of our murder. And when we murder babies, we do it legally. No one's forcing anybody.
Yeah.
We all happily volunteer to sacrifice our unborn children. We all happily volunteer to destroy the family. Communism had to force it on people. We do it happily and gleefully, as freedom, as being a strong, independent woman, as living out my freedom in life, right? So what we do is tremendously worse. And the reason that happens is because the soul is rotting away, because there's sin on the soul. And if you're going to ignore all this sexual license, all this theological license, where you believe whatever you want, you could do whatever you want, then I don't care what you say about communism, because all of that's going to happen, whether it's forced through communism or socialism, or whether it's voted on in our nice little republic where we just happily do all those things anyway. So I don't really see a huge difference, other than the fact that communism was a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if I can kill my unborn child because of an inconvenience, this child is in the way of my freedom, my life, that kind of thing, right? And let's even take like a case of rape, right? Because I've heard this recently from students. It's like, well, what do you expect me to do? Look at that child every day after what's been done to me, this kind of thing, that kind of thing, right? If we can use those as excuses for murdering on an individual level, the baby, right? Then why can't governments take that same logic and apply it to the country of its people, to say, you expect us to put up with these violent people? Look at the crimes we're having, the mass shootings. You expect us to have to look at that every day? Why can't we just kill them? Why can't we just imprison them in camps? Why can't we just eliminate the problem? We do it for our unborn children on a personal level, on an individual level. Why not export that to higher forms of government, to where they say the same thing? You are like our children, as far as we're concerned. And you, like that unwanted pregnancy, you're unwanted. You're stopping the country from progressing. You're slowing the country down by your presence, okay? By your thoughts that apparently don't are sinless. Uh, by your actions, okay? You're useless eaters. It makes sense in a utilitarian world that you need to be removed in some form or fashion. And it very well could logically make sense. But the thing is, just because it's logical and makes sense, that doesn't make it moral. That doesn't make it reasonable, and it sure as hell doesn't make it in line with Jesus Christ, with God. All right, it doesn't work. And the thing
Yeah.
is, once you removed God, you've destroyed the very building blocks of society: father, mother, child. Okay, and you've instilled this idea of license into everybody. Right? What's left? Why do I care about the economy then? Why do I care about spending or the budget or restricting, other rights? We've already destroyed society at that point. What do I care about communism at that point? Because none of that's going to fix the problem. Because you've placed error on the same field as truth. You said they're the same. They're the same? Well, fine, we're going to live that out. And you will get communism. You will get socialism, right? You're going to get all of that because you've made these two things, error and truth, the same. So it's all relative. It's just a matter of time before the people you don't like gain the power. And by the way, they're going to get it by the will of the people.
Yeah,
because you've just destroyed any morality for the people.
Yep. And I think to close it out, since we started with Beck, we'll close out with Beck here and watching this breaking news special, how America is lost and on the verge of collapse here. You got a situation where, you know, you can see what Beck is focusing on, and that is the materialism, right? The material dialectic, where what is success in America? It's the wealth we accumulate. There's no moral principles other than these abstract personal Jesus kind of morality or moral principles that we believe in. But then again, Mr. Beck is the author of this idea of covenant theology that, every few years we kind of go back to God and we renegotiate the terms of condition, So it's like, well, what is morality at the end of the day? And why does God continue to fail us if we have to renegotiate the terms with him every few years? Now, they were probably because we failed God. Yeah, but America is perfect. It was perfect from the get-go. We got these great constitutional principles. How did we fail God? God had to fail us if you're going to push this idea of covenant theology. And some conservatives, even Protestants, are picking up on this. You know who's pushing this issue too was that former actor from Growing Pains, Kirk Cameron.
He's into it.
Yeah, he's into that, right? Where he had a party at his house and everybody can sign the document of these stated principles honoring God. It's like, guys, really?
Okay, we got it. We got it now. Kirk, come over here. Kirk signed the paper. We're good.
The sign is put it up on the wall, and that's our deal with God. It's like
the problem is that God didn't make a covenant with us. We're trying to make it with him, but he never made it with us.
And so
he didn't sign the paper.
I'm shaking my head because as a Catholic, Neil, one of the greatest things we have is the certitude of a 2,000-year analogy of the faith, an unbroken analogy of the faith that is consistent through every ancestral generation, right? It's like I've always said, I can look at my faith that I inherited from my parents, and my parents got it from my grandparents, and my grandparents from my great-grandparents. And sure, there might have been a conversion or two at some point, somewhere down the line. But generally, we are family. We have the pedigree. And so when the church says to me, this is a mortal sin, and it's been a mortal sin since the day of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, there's no greater covenant than that. There's no need to renegotiate the terms and conditions, Neil. And yet these Protestants, a lot of them classical liberals, keep telling us as America fails, God is failing with America. It's what it sounds like to me.
Well, they've got this idea of this is the Holy Land, which makes sense if you're a Mormon, really, because they
yeah, that does. Yeah, you're right.
If you're a Mormon, it makes a lot of sense. But I mean, I saw the Kirk Cameron thing when he was doing he wrote a book about it. Yeah. And I commented going, I'm sorry, I thought God had to make covenants with people, not we make covenants
Yeah,
with him.
that's right.
And someone tried to say, well, marriage is a covenant that we make. I'm going, but it's God who instituted holy matrimony.
That's right.
We enter into it, but it's
Yeah.
something he already instituted. We just join with it, right? We make our vows to each other, right? But he instituted holy matrimony. We didn't just make it up.
Yeah.
So once again, that's God making the covenant, and then we go entering into it. God didn't make a covenant with Abraham Lincoln or the founding fathers.
Yeah.
Now, because Black Beck always tries to say, well, Lincoln did this covenantal thing.
And
And I
save the
think it's funny.
country, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's funny he goes back to Abraham Lincoln, who consolidated power.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm saying, right?
Who basically made our modern federalist system that got out of
Yeah.
hand.
Who basically said, no more revolutions, you're
Yeah.
done. I'm going to increase the power of the federal government. Screw you to the states.
Yep.
That's what Lincoln did. The
Yeah.
irony of that.
So this idea that this guy basically takes over, but he made a covenant with God. It's like, okay, what covenant was he making? Because I'm not so sure God liked it. It's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah,
It's anything to try and tie. It's like they're trying to
yeah,
give us some kind of
yeah,
mythological history, you
yeah.
know, when it's straightforward. Enlightenment thinkers attacked God and his church, broke away from all of that to form this secular society.
Yeah.
And they used religious language, like from quotes from the Bible, to accomplish that task. Just like Hitler, you try to use religion. He tried to make deals with the bishops in Germany and that kind of thing until he got power. And then you're out. We're done. Right. So,
Yeah.
and I'm not
Well,
saying the founding fathers were Hitler, by the way. I'm not trying to say
no, I
that they were
know.
that bad.
Yeah, and listen, the founding fathers might have been sincere in their beliefs. I don't
Yeah.
doubt that, right? Because let's be honest, the founding of America, it was a giant, excuse my language here, Protestant cluster fart, right? Because it's the end result or the offshoots of the Protestant Reformation and all the doctrinal chaos of Protestantism. What was America? It was Protestant sects warring against each other. That's the irony of it all. And maybe it was so broken, so confusing, so many contradictions. I could see how the founding fathers were sincere in what they were trying to establish. Now, the question, of course, went back to the Protestant Reformation. Can you break away from the one true church, again, with a consistent analogy of the faith that goes back to Christ, with the sacraments, with the saints, with all the theology, break away from that and think your civilization or your country can survive? And that's exactly what we're suffering from today, is a soulless secular nation at this point in history. And so, and even going back to the Civil War, Jefferson Davis was corresponding with Pope Pius IX, who was going through a revolutionary period in Italy at the time. Well, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you correct me here, Abraham Lincoln was actually communicating with Karl Marx. Now, the extent of that conversation, I read it a while back. I don't remember specifically, but the optics just don't look good. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I don't know how far it went. I remember reading Ferrera's book,
Yeah.
Liberty God Died. He mentions that the Southern president was talking to the Pope. Lincoln was talking to Marx. But what ended up happening was the ambassador from the North got to meet with the Pope while the Southern guy was like kind of shunned. So that kind of changed the optics and everything it's like the Pope never outright came out and said, I'm supporting the side.
There you go. Okay.
But it's like he accepted the Northern ambassador to visit, but he didn't accept the Southern ambassador. I believe is the way it happened. And I might be wrong in how I'm reporting that, but I believe that's what I read in this book. But he did have positive things. The Pope did have positive things to say about Davis. But yeah, it's basically what's happening today is a revolt and a destruction of what the founding fathers put together, right? And to that I say, now you know how the Catholics feel when you revolted and created the United States.
Yeah, yeah, I know, I know, I
when
know.
when y'all just basically destroyed all of our, like, all the old monarchies, all the
Yeah,
old Catholic cathedrals. The French Revolution came after, but still, it was the destruction of Catholicity in these countries. And yeah, you're kind of ticked off about it and you're trying to fight it. Well, guess what? That's what we had to do when y'all revolted. When the Protestants revolted, and then finally when they revolted again to make, the United States and whatnot. Um, you could see how, gee, it's a little similar, and how I may feel
yeah.
about that.
And I think one final thing here, Neil, and I want to refer back to Beck. I don't want to be mean here. I don't want to slander the man. I don't. But I think there's some genuine confusion when it comes to religious ideas of religious philosophy in the man's mind, right? Because he
Oh,
really prides himself off being really religious, right? Really spiritual, right? He says he talks with God and he prays and all this stuff.
it's his Mormonism that's the problem.
Yeah, and see, and this is what I'm getting at, because here we are, we're talking about Mormon. He's a Mormon. We're talking about this American indifferent God. What else he talked about? He talked about covenant theology and things like that. But then every once in a while, he'll be like, yeah, and when we're looking for a desperate sign of God, he'll mention something like, yeah, and that thing in Fatima with the Catholics, that was God warning us. And I'm thinking to myself, Neil, I'm Catholic. I believe it's the one true faith. We have a consistent analogy, like I said, for 2,000 years. I would never refer to Mormon prophecy. I would never refer
Yeah.
to Protestant prophecy. I would never refer to any other religion's prophecy. But I guess my question, in his mind, what is religion to Glenn Beck when you could just take a little bit of this, a little bit of that to make your point? There's nothing consistent in the man's mind, it seems like, Neil.
It seems like, and a little bit of everything, but I believe that's what Mormonism is, though. Since its founding, it's been a little bit of everything. It kind of takes from it.
Yeah.
Um, that's why he loves to reference ignorantly. He references the Gnostics. He doesn't know they're called the Gnostics. he, he's talking about these ancient Christians hid these documents in clay jars to preserve them from the leadership of that time. He's kind of like implying it's the Catholic Church that's out to get them. He doesn't say, but the church.
Oh, geez.
They're hiding it in these clay jars. They're saving these documents from the. They're the Gnostics, you idiot. And the Gnostics had so-called secret writings that completely contradicted Scripture.
Oh
What are you
my God.
talking about, dude? They weren't preserving anything.
Yeah, it's far off base, and that's why when Beck preaches religion on the air, I think it's one of the most dangerous things that there is. He's truly misguiding people in the name of God. Right? Granted, this indifferent God, but it's. Listen. I listen for Beck. Um, I think like you, because it's enjoyable to listen to man really
Yeah.
just. It's just you sit
Well,
there and you shake your head.
he's good. He's good at telling a story. Okay, he
Yeah,
can
he
do a good
is.
job
I
telling
give
a
him that.
story.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
the way he presents the information, like the news or whatever he's talking about, is
yeah,
entertaining. You know, he's got a good voice for radio.
yeah.
you know,
Listen,
and,
I'm
and
sure he's
and
a
another
nice.
thing is too,
Yeah,
I don't have a lot of places to go as far as to listen to something.
yeah,
Like like I would have liked to have listened to Rush Limbaugh at one time, right? But his stuff you had to pay for.
right,
Glenn is free on iHeartRadio. You
right,
know, so it's and
right.
like I'll listen to his friend Pat. Pat's funny to listen to. He's like the joking guy. And Stu. Stu likes to make fun of Glenn. That makes me
Yeah,
laugh.
and,
So
and
that's why
listen,
I'll listen.
yeah, and listen. I don't dislike Mr. Beck. I think he's probably a fine human being, a fine person, right? I'm sure he truly cares. But when you mix, how should I put this, Neil? Conservative Incorporated and religion together, I think it becomes a problem. Just like I think all of talk radio at this point, because it's a major money maker for a lot of these guys with sweet gigs. I think oftentimes there's problems with that. It's
Yeah.
like I said before, these guys will never call the Calvary charge. They won't, because their gig is too sweet at the end of the day. Now, I could be wrong on one or two individuals that may stand on principle, but I've never seen it in the roughly 25 years I've been listening to talk radio, including Limbaugh. And it's like I said so many times before, even when I was listening to Limbaugh back in the day, early 2000, late 90s, early 2000, every time something will go wrong on the political right, his big thing was, folks, calm down. I'm a Rushbo. I'm Mr. Realville. Now's not the time to panic. I will let you know when it's time to panic, America. That was Rush's line.
Which will be never.
And listen, with all due respect, may God bless his soul, wherever he is now, right? I loved Rush for many years, but he came and went, and he never sounded the cavalry charge. Nobody ever does at the end of the day. And America goes further and further and further to the left. And we go back to where we started this podcast. How do we stop this nation from going further and further to the left on these principles of the Enlightenment, Neil?
You don't.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm sorry. There might have been a time when I was more hopeful, but I don't know. It's not going.
What about when they come?
Well.
What about when they come after the children?
They already have.
Yeah, I know they have. I know. I'm just trying to think of a final line where conservatives finally draw the line.
They already have, and they've won, as far as that's concerned. Yeah. Where did the kids spend the 90% of their day?
Yeah.
In a government education system.
Yeah.
Where did they spend the rest of their day? In front of a screen, telling them to go against every principle and value your parents might be trying to teach you.
Yeah, listen.
Where do you spend your day? Out and about at work with people telling you you're wrong about to have these values.
That's right. That's right. And listen, I'm in the Midwest, and I pulled my daughter out of public school a couple of years ago. And as she was about to go into high school, the school where my son went to and graduated the year he left, they put litter boxes in the bathrooms for apparently the kids. I think they're cats or dogs or something. Like, I don't know. I don't understand it. They put litter boxes so they could take a crap in the litter box instead of the toilet, Neil. I don't understand it.
So can they build chapels because I identify as a Catholic? And
see, there you go. I don't know what to say. I don't know. It is clown world at this point in history. And ironically enough, it's all been ushered in under the guise of liberalism, classical liberalism to start with. Your final thoughts, my friend?
Yeah, I think the country's hopeless as far as that's concerned. Yeah. Like, I do not think you're going to have, well, one, it's impossible to have a party rise up outside of the two-party system.
Yeah.
The monopoly is so set. It's even in law, basically, that prevents any third party from coming up to challenge the other parties. Yeah. And as long as that's in place, what hope is there? Yeah. You have to go with whatever. You can vote third party, but sometimes, but that's like,
throwing away your
it's
vote.
Nothing.
A lot of people tell you
it's
that.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you really are, because they're not going to go anywhere. Like, even if a vast majority voted for a third party, guess what? They still wouldn't get anywhere. All right. Because it's set in stone that these are the two acceptable parties. They will maintain power. They will be your leaders. And that's the end of the story. And is there anything you want to do about it? Well, you can't, because Lincoln solved that question, answered that question. No, you're not going to do like the founding fathers did. And
you're not allowed to
revolt. You're not rebelling. You're not. And there was talk of secession, which is basically revolt.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because if you try to secede, one, Lincoln already answered that question. There is no legal right to secede.
Right.
Okay. So you have no right, and you can't do it legally, which means you'd have to do it illegally, which means they're going to respond with the military, which means now you're in a revolution. Okay. Yeah. No one's going to participate in a bloody revolution. No, they're not going to.
Nobody is. Nobody is.
Even the gun toters who all claim, I'm waiting for that moment. I'm waiting for that day. Yeah. When the power goes out for 3 days and no help's coming, guess what? You're laying down arms so you can go back to work and get a paycheck because everything went bad in the refrigerator. Okay. You're not going to do it. Okay. And by the way, wars last for years, not just a week, a month. Years. And you
Yeah.
mean to tell me you're going to go live out in the bayou
Yeah.
for the next 5 to 10 years as you fight the war, outmanned, outgunned, right?
Yeah.
And you have no communication with the rest of the army, by the way. You're just some guy in the
Yeah.
bayou, right? So it's like
You
it's
cut,
impossible logistically. You're not going to do it.
you cut the
So
lights, you cut the lights, and you stop all the trucks from shipping around all supplies. We're completely dependent on this usury system, on a high
yep,
finance system, on a service sector economy. Americans would literally starve. That's all it's going to take. I know I
yeah,
keep hearing about the good old boys down in Texas, but
yeah,
I've been hearing about them for the past 30 years. And so, listen, I don't know what the answer here is at this point. To be honest with you, I'm just as confused as everybody else. But it's clown world out there, and let's pray to God for a peaceful solution. Because I don't favor any kind of war. I don't favor any kind of revolution.
yeah.
It's never been my thing. Americans fighting against other Americans, something I don't want to see. I understand the evil times we're living in, but the whole talk of revolt and revolution, just not my thing. I don't
Yeah,
even
and
hear
on top of that, for anything like a revolution to even work, you need something that unifies that group.
that. Exactly.
There's no
No,
unification.
it's like
Yeah.
I can say, what's the unifying force? Constitution 2.0? It didn't work the first time. When's it going to work the second time? What unified? And this is, it's funny you bring that up. I just had this conversation. I interviewed Charles Colomb about the coronation of Charles III. And think what you may think of that as an American, right? It's not my king, not my problem,
Yeah.
kiss my ass, all that stuff we think in regards to authoritarian governments. At least the British have something that brings them together. Something. What do we have in America? A turkey dinner and Super Bowl Sunday? What brings us together? I
I do
don't
like
know.
turkey.
And again, because we have our individual rights to tell
Yeah.
everybody, kiss my ass. How
Hmm.
do you form community? How do you form patriotism? How do you form anything out of that attitude, Neil?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, you're just not going to have it happen.
That's right.
Okay. It's there's no unifying force to even have that happen, even if you surmounted all the other
Yeah.
problems.
Yep.
I mean, you can't even get a constitutional convention going. They've been howling about that for the last 5, 10 years
I
or
know.
longer.
I know.
You can't even get that going. How are you going to get a bunch of guys to go fight a war?
The Vendée united behind Christ and the church. The
Hmm.
Cristeros united behind Christ and the church. The Irish united behind Christ and the church. Something meaningful, something that people are willing to die for. The one true faith of Holy Mother Church. In America, we got, like Depeche Mode said, personal Jesus, right? That's what we have. So we can't
Yep.
even agree on which version of Jesus we agree upon.
Hmm.
Never mind trying to find common values, Neil. So there you have it, my friend. Neil, buddy, great cast. I really enjoyed doing these with you. I hope we could do a few more often, I should say. Thanks, my friend, for
Yeah.
joining me.
My pleasure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's Neil Bodenheimer, a good friend of mine, talking politics. Listen, if we got your hopelessness meter up a little higher after the
Yeah.
show, I'm sorry. I'm just calling like I see it at this point.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, it's not even me anymore. It's even the conservatives that are saying this to me now. They just don't have a resolution to the problem. So I apologize if I got you dispirited. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Frank. Once again, I want to thank my friend Neil for joining me tonight. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.